So welcome again, everybody, to the inaugural event of the Civics project. This is our launch, and today's theme is an introduction to governance. I am Beth Rebay, the Director of Repair and the coordinator for this project, and I'm really excited to be with you all. I'm joining the Zoom and podcast today from Los Angeles, where Repair is based. And I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. Repair acknowledges the Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tuvangar, which is the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Tarahatom, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanukvatam, the ancestors, Ahihiram, elders, and Eohinkem, our relatives, relations, past, present, and emerging. I want to just give our audience a quick overview of the program structure. This beginning part, which will be available every week, as noted, will be featuring either a simple lecture, or sometimes guests will be in conversation with each other, or an interview with a particular person. And that part of the program will be released as a podcast episode. And in addition, we will always have a few trivia questions at the end of our educational or lecture component, and a book recommendation. And for those who are joining us live in Zoom each weekend, there'll then be time for dialogue and Q&A. So today's subject is an introduction to governance, and I want to say a little bit about what it means to govern. If you were to look up definitions of the word, there would be a few, but the most common one would be something like this: to conduct the policy, actions, and affairs of a state, organization, or people. And in essence, what we know from that is that if you are governing, you're somebody who's running things. You are making choices, you're deciding how things should be organized, and you have a lot of authority which affects the lives of others. So the second question I want to engage is, what type of government exists in the United States? And there are a lot of different answers to that question. The origins of the government in the United States is in European colonization. We have a lot of hierarchies. We have both centralized and decentralized government. Centralized is when there's authority in a sort of singular national entity, like our federal government, but we also have decentralization of some aspects of governance, things that are left up to municipalities and to states, cities, counties, and the US states and territories. And we have a capitalist economy, and we also have some kind of democracy. The historian Timothy Snyder has sometimes said we should think of the United States as what's called an aspirational democracy, meaning we don't actually have one that functions the way that democracy should, but we're sort of trying towards it some of the time with success or failure. You also may know the term representative democracy. And a representative democracy is basically where people have a democratic process in which you elect people to then represent the interests of others. And some folks may say, well, what would be the alternative? And because we have a nation with 328, 29, maybe depending on the next census, it'll be a bit higher, 30 million people, we can't have what we would think of as a direct democracy. Imagine if every time someone wanted to pass a law, everyone in the United States would need to have the opportunity to vote on it. So we use representative democracy for decision-making, for authority, but there's still some democratic process because people choose at least some of who those representatives are. And you may have heard people in media refer to small d democracy. That's where there's localized democracy, people getting to run themselves, getting to make local decisions. So my comments today are going to focus on representation, the politics of representing others, having decision-making power, control over resources, status, prestige, telling stories which become our collective knowledge and our history. And this is not just about, or I would argue that representation is not just about representing the interests of others. Elected representatives also make representations, they make claims, and they have power and ability to define and name things in influential ways. And you might be thinking of ways that that's very significant right now in US politics. But I'm going to take us back for a bit into the 19th century and focus, again, a lot of today's narrative around an example that comes from 1840 and the period slightly after. So I want to introduce folks to someone named William Augustus Weaver. I'm guessing no one in our live audience will have heard that name, but I'm glad to be surprised, and you can indicate in the chat if you have. And William Weaver was appointed to be the first ever superintending clerk of the 1840 US Census. He was appointed by the Secretary of State, John Forsyth, under President Martin Van Buren. Until then, the census, which is required to be taken every 10 years, is mandated under the Constitution. But in a much smaller United States, it had been simply undertaken under the authority of the Secretary of State. And as the United States was growing and more states were being admitted to it, they were realizing they needed somebody to distinctly run this project. And so William Augustus Weaver, again, was the first person appointed to that post. And his job was to run, organize, and administer, and then analyze the results of the US Census. And he had some staffing support, but it was under his authority. Now, the US Census categories were different in 1840 than they are in, let's say, 2020 or 2010, or any time in recent memory. And I'm going to have to use some problematic language in order to tell you what the categories were like then. I won't go over all of them, but there's a couple that are relevant to our discussion. And in 1840, the US Census had some new categories, relatively new categories. And one of them was idiot. And it referenced somebody who was cognitively impaired. So the census was interested in counting people who were under this classification. And there was also a census category titled insane/lunatic to count people who were considered mentally ill. So two census categories, and they wanted to classify and count how many people in the United States fell into either of those two categories, idiot or insane lunatic. And again, just want to acknowledge to anybody who is vested in disability communities that I recognize that there are problematic things about the language, and they were the literal census categories at the time. So William Weaver administered the 1840s US Census and came back with some really interesting results and controversial results. And one of the things that he found was that the rates of idiocy and insanity both appeared to be approximately 10 times higher among Black people in the US North, which did not have slave owning at the time, as compared to enslaved Blacks in the US South. So in other words, free Blacks, according to the US Census, were 10 times more likely to be mentally ill or cognitively impaired than enslaved Blacks. Now, to understand why this result was not just puzzling, but highly political, it's important to understand that there was a very active abolition movement at this point. This was about one generation before the Civil War. And that the arguments of the abolition movement were mostly moral and emotional, appealing to people's consciences based on the tremendous suffering that was present in the US slave trade. And pro-slavery Southerners at that time were arguing for the admission of Texas, which was a slave state, to the United States. So Texas was not a US state. And pro-slavery advocates in Congress and in the federal government wanted it to be admitted to the Union. And so the pro-slavery Southerners were delighted with this result, and they used the census data as evidence to counter the emotional and moral arguments against slavery posed by abolitionists. One of the Southern newspapers commenting on the census published a statement in defense of the institution of slavery and the supposed dangers of abolition, and said that the free Black people of the northern states, quote, are among the most vicious persons on this continent, perhaps on the earth, close quote. This kind of rhetoric was particularly embraced by a politician named John C. Calhoun. And he held many offices over his career. He had been vice president to 2 different US presidents. He had been the Secretary of War, the Secretary of State. He had a couple terms in the US House, and he had a couple terms in the Senate. Slightly before the census was taken, he had advanced an argument that slavery was, quote, a positive good, close quote, which improved Black people, in his words. And so he took the census data as an affirmation of his political rhetoric. And the 1840s US Census was used both to support the admission of Texas, a slave state, into the Union, and to, again, try to undermine the work of abolitionists. So I want to talk about the data and note that at the time there were some statisticians who were really trying to figure out how to make sense of those results. And one of those was a person named Dr. Edward Jarvis, and he was anti-slavery in his sentiments, basically pretty connected to the abolition movement. And so he was trying to figure out how to interpret or spin this data in order to not have it simply affirm slavery. And he came up with some suggestions, like maybe the harms inflicted under slavery combined with the stresses of readjusting, adapting to life in the Northern economic structure were causing people to go crazy. The critical point, though, was that initially, at least for about 3 years, the results were accepted as scientifically accurate and valid since they came through the US Census. And so people struggled to develop different interpretations for the formally established fact that everybody accepted, that leaving slavery was apparently causing Black people to go crazy or to lose their intelligence while remaining enslaved was benign and apparently promoted mental health. However, after a few years, Dr. Jarvis realized that there was a different explanation for the data. As he was studying the census data from 1840, he realized that William Weaver had taken the residents of a whites-only mental hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts, which Dr. Jarvis happened to be familiar with, and again, which did not admit any Black patients. And he had classified all of the patients in the hospital as Black on the US Census in order to construct his statistics in that region. As Dr. Jarvis explored further, he found that in other states, the data had been similarly altered, with mentally ill white people being reclassified as Black on the census. In other words, he discovered that the data and Weaver's claims about the census were entirely false and did not support any claim that freedom was harmful to mental health or slavery conducive to it. Dr. Jarvis teamed up with someone named James McCune Smith. And James McCune Smith was the first Black person in the United States to hold a medical degree. Now, it's notable that there were no medical schools which would admit any Black people at the time. He had applied and been rejected. And so he had to travel to Europe in order to become an MD. He went to Scotland and got his medical degree at the University of Glasgow, and then traveled back to the United States. So Dr. McCune Smith and Dr. Jarvis worked together to publicly challenge the data, and they worked particularly through the vehicle of the relatively recently formed American Statistical Association, in which Dr. Jarvis held some leadership. A couple things to know about Dr. McCune Smith. He identified himself as born the son of a self-emancipated bondwoman. His mother had been born a slave in South Carolina, not coincidentally the home state to John C. Calhoun, the politician we mentioned earlier, and had been able to free herself and gave birth to him in Manhattan. McCune Smith worked directly with folks like Frederick Douglass and John Brown as an abolitionist, and he was also a suffragist. He was somebody who was invested in the 1840s in the rights of women. They found a potential ally in John Quincy Adams, who some of you may know as the former 6th president of the United States. Now, today in the United States, when someone's president, that's pretty much their last formal job, right? Once they finish their 1 or 2 terms. most of the time. They do things like write books and speak, and sometimes they start foundations. But at this time in U.S. history, people not uncommonly went from the presidency back into other positions of elected office. So after his term in the presidency, John Quincy Adams had eventually returned to the U.S. Senate, and that's where he was at the time of the 1840 U.S. Census and its challenge. At the time, he was one of the most prominent anti-slavery politicians. I don't know this for a fact, but I credit that, I imagine at least, that can be credited in part to the influence of his mother, Abigail Adams, who some of you may have heard of, along with Susan B. Anthony, as a prominent women's rights advocate in the early constitutional and revolutionary period. His father, John Adams, who was the second president to the United States, as well as George Washington's vice president, was not nearly so sympathetic to such causes. But John Quincy Adams was in that period a bit closer to a progressive. And again, he was the most powerful of those politicians who were anti-slavery. So the challenges raised by Dr. Jarvis and Dr. McCune Smith came to the attention of Senator Adams, and he attempted to convene an investigative committee in 1845, but he was countered by John C. Calhoun, who had been serving as Secretary of State in the beginning of that year through March, and then had re-entered the U.S. Senate representing South Carolina in November of that year. Instead of having an independent investigation or a Senate investigative body, Calhoun decided to appoint somebody himself to investigate the Senate, and he chose William Augustus Weaver. So he said, William Weaver, go ahead and investigate yourself. Figure out if you did something improper in your collection of the data. And as you might imagine, William Weaver showed up to the Senate and insisted that the data was all accurate. And to my knowledge, he never wound up facing any formal consequences for tampering with or falsifying the 1840 census data. What can we learn from this example? To govern, to represent, carries with it the power to construct facts, to make claims with the weight of authority, and to shape what people believe to be true. In essence, those who govern create powerful and influential realities. The contemporary relevance for us in January of 2021, after the very recent event termed the Capitol riots, is notable, and some of you may already be making those connections. As we contemplate the reintroduction of the Confederate flag into the US Capitol on January 6th, and as we witness and participate in immediately raging debates about whether, when, and how powerful elected officials can or should be held accountable for lying, learning about civics is useful in generating recognition that the foundations laid in the 19th century US government are continuing to shape the 21st century US government. To further illustrate the point, it's helpful to learn a little bit more about the backstory affecting folks like John Quincy Adams, who attempted to investigate Weaver's census, and John C. Calhoun, who intervened to protect and validate it. Calhoun had actually served as John Quincy Adams' own vice president after each of them was elected in 1824 to office. John Quincy Adams had been facing off against Andrew Jackson in 1824. And there were also two other candidates, both from the Democratic Republican Party. Now, the Federalist Party, which those of you who are Hamilton fans may have some knowledge of, thanks to Lin-Manuel Miranda, had collapsed at this point just recently. And so in its absence, the candidates on the ballot were primarily, or certainly the lead ones, were both from the, or all from the Democratic, or mostly from the Democratic Republican Party. And that included both John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. With four candidates on the ballot, nobody actually won the majority of the votes, either popular or electoral. The person who got the most votes, called the plurality of votes, was Andrew Jackson. But without the majority, he was not declared the winner. And the decision at that time, in that circumstance, meaning when no one candidate gets the majority, is that then the candidates' names are given to the House of Representatives and they elect the president. So Congress chose the president. And although Andrew Jackson had gotten the plurality of the electoral and popular vote more than any other candidate because he had not gotten the majority, the House was able to override that and to select John Quincy Adams. And they did so amidst tremendous conflict and outrage from Andrew Jackson and his supporters, who alleged that John Quincy Adams won by promising one or more cabinet positions to influential Congress people, which may have been true, I don't know. As a result, the Democratic-Republican Party fractured and never existed as a singular party again. And it split into two parties, one of which became known as the Democratic Party, and the other the National Republican Party. And contention about this process in which Congress chose the president in contradiction to the popular and electoral vote, again, was central to the split of the two parties into the antagonistic two-party system we continue to live with in the United States. In 1828, John Quincy Adams ran for re-election against Andrew Jackson after a fairly vicious campaign. There was a lot of personal mudslinging on both sides. And Jackson teamed up with John Calhoun, who had been John Quincy Adams' vice president, as his running mate. So John Calhoun got to serve again under Andrew Jackson, who was deeply antagonistic towards John Quincy Adams. Now I want to just note that we've heard a bit more about Andrew Jackson of late, as he's been repeatedly praised by ex-President Trump, who placed a portrait of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office and visited his tomb in Tennessee soon after he was inaugurated in 2017. I recently read one journalist describe Trump as having a bromance with Andrew Jackson across the centuries. But returning to the 1840s, as you can, or actually in this instance in the 1820s, if we're talking about John Quincy Adams' first successful presidential election and then unsuccessful bid for election in 1828. This left significant negative history between John Quincy Adams and John C. Calhoun. And in addition to their disagreements about slavery, which they carried into their now distinct parties, and continue to enact these differences throughout the remainder of their careers. Notably, at the time, it was the Republican Party which was somewhat more receptive to John Quincy Adams' anti-slavery beliefs, and the Democratic Party, which at the time energetically embodied the pro-slavery positions of Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun. And while both parties were fairly consistently committed to the ongoing colonization of indigenous people, the Democratic Party in 1828 particularly enabled Jackson's efforts to enact Indian removal policies in the eastern United States, which culminated in the Trail of Tears. The gradual shift of the Republican Party into a more conservative entity and the Democratic Party into a comparatively less conservative entity occurred in substantially later generations. Again, though, we can note the resonance with past and present historical moments, as while the Democratic Republican parties have in certain respects switched places, they've again been navigating very intense conflict about the prospect, even if much less realizable now, that Congress could successfully override both the popular and electoral vote, as it did do in the 19th century in order to elect John Quincy Adams in 1824. And this month, on January 7th, in the middle of the night, we know that more than 100 members of Congress voiced objections on record to the certification of the 2020 electoral vote based on the premise that they might, if only symbolically, still override both the popular and electoral vote. As I was reviewing a little of this history and feeling predictably troubled and taking note of the resonance between South Carolina's John C. Calhoun in the 1820s and 1840s, and thinking about points of similarity to South Carolina's Lindsey Graham today, I started imagining a conversation across 180 years between Dr. James McCune Smith and Stacey Abrams. I contemplated what James might share about abolition, about his mother, whose name was Lavinia Smith, and who, as noted, had been born in John C. Calhoun's home state of South Carolina and gave birth to her son James in Manhattan. I pictured what James McCune Smith would say about health and medicine and science and what drove him to leave the continent at a time when there were no airplanes to get a medical degree in a context where formal medical education was impossible to access anywhere within the United States for him. and about the government he returned to challenge and to attempt to hold accountable and the costs of doing that work. And then I pictured Stacey Abrams and thought about what she might share with him about the Black Lives Matter movement today, about going to Yale, the highest ranked law school in the United States, about her new book, which is titled Our Time Is Now, about changing the South, about losing and winning harder, and about the government she's challenging and changing and beginning to hold more accountable and the costs of doing that work. And all the people who are mobilizing with her in Georgia and around the nation, and what they're still living with and enduring, and who they are today. And I want to just carefully acknowledge that I can't, of course, speak at all to what either of them might think or feel, but as a student of civics, I felt a lot of gratitude imagining this conversation. It was a powerful exercise to think about the fact that he was an abolitionist and a suffragist, and that neither of them existed even within a century of the other. He died in 1865. It's notable that he did live to see emancipation. He died later that same year, about 5 weeks before the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. And Stacey Abrams was born 108 years later, roughly 107, 108 in 1973. But I can think of him as helping to shape the context of her life and of her embodying at least some of the future possibilities he was working for. I talked initially about two meanings of representation. First, to represent the interests of others who have given power to you or who have not. And the second, to make representations that name and define others and that shape collective reality until your statements become accepted fact. But I was thinking about the life of James McCune Smith and about the way Stacey Abrams is living, and it put me in mind of the third meaning of the term represent. Like when someone says, you've got to represent, it's an invocation to show up for your people. To represent in this context means to embody, to behave with integrity and creativity and strength that's grounded in commitment to the community that you come from. And that prompts me to imagine what democracy might be like if it were, in that sense, representative. So that ends my lecture. And I want to invite at this point any questions from our live audience in the chat, and invite our podcast audience to reflect a little more as we do that. We're also, as our audience adds those questions to the chat, going to switch gears slightly. And I mentioned that at the beginning that each week we will run a little feature that involves trivia questions. And I've titled that Civics Trivia, or I know this is a little corny, but Civ Triv for short. And we're going to go ahead and start with those questions and then see if there are any more audience questions before we end our recording today. So I'm just about to launch those. For our live audience, you get some graphics. So let me just share screen. And for those on the podcast, we'll read them out so you can still hear them. So our civics trivia, we have 3 questions today. And again, for our live audience, you're welcome to write your answers in the chat if you have an educated guess or no. And question number 1, how many Supreme Court justices were originally mandated by the U.S. Constitution? So choice A is 5, choice B is 7, choice C is 9, and choice D is none of the above. So everybody can take a second to think about that. And I'll share the correct answer now. Some of you have guesses in the chat. Our audience is guessing. We're seeing mostly folks guessing 5 or guessing D, none of the above. And those of you who guessed none of the above are correct. The Constitution does not indicate how many Supreme Court justices should be provided for. It only provides a basic process that they should be proposed by the president with the approval of and consent of the Senate. You'll find references to the Supreme Court just a handful of times in the Constitution, and there's pretty sparse guidance about their responsibilities and the process by which they're selected, how many, and the terms and conditions of their office. So, second trivia question. Raphael Warnock was just elected to the U.S. Senate representing Georgia. When will he be up for re-election? First choice, A, 2022, in 2 years. B, 2024, in 4 years. C, 2026, in 6 years. Or D, none of the above. Take just a second to think about it. When will Raphael Warnock be up for re-election in the U.S. Senate in Georgia? The correct answer is A, 2022. Now, it's important to note that U.S. senators are generally elected for 6-year terms. But, and the Senate is divided into what are called 3 classes. And so 1/3 of the Senate, one class, goes up for re-election every 6 years. The reason that Raphael Warnock's appointment is only going to last for 2 years before he has to seek re-election is because he is finishing the term of another senator who had to resign early. That was Republican Senator from Georgia, Johnny Isakson, who resigned at the end of 2019 due to Parkinson's disease. Now, when a senator's term is unfinished before the next election, the governor in that state can appoint, and this is provided for under an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The governor in that state can appoint somebody to fill the seat until the next scheduled election. And so when Johnny Isakson stepped down at the end of 2019, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp appointed Kelly Loeffler to hold his seat through the November 2020 election and then until the beginning of the new term of Congress, which began at the beginning of this year. So Raphael Warnock went up against Kelly Loeffler in order to be able to finish Johnny Isakson's term. But Johnny Isakson had originally been elected in 2016, so his term ends on December 31st of 2022, and that's why Raphael Warnock will potentially have to run for re-election in 2022 if he wants to continue to serve in 2023. Last trivia question. Roughly how many white people in the United States share each of the major values of the alt-right? So our first choice is 250,000. Our second choice is B, 2.4 million. Our third choice is C, 11 million. D, 74 million. And E, no data is available. So choices again for our podcast audience: 250,000, 2.4 million, 11 million, 74 million, or we don't know. And the question is, how many white people in the U.S. share each of the major values of the alt-right, which is a white nationalist organization? So the answer, and again, this is an estimate, is C, 11 million. And the reason that we know that is due to data collected in the 2016 presidential election, and its analysis by a political scientist from the University of Alabama by the name of George Hawley. And he identified 3 major values of the alt-right. One is a very strong sense of white identity. A second is an emphasis on the importance of white people acting in solidarity, right? So acting in support of one another, backing each other in opposition to each other, in opposition to others, rather. And the third is a sense that white people are being victimized, right? So those are the 3 values that he identified that are consistent with the alt-right. And he found that roughly 5.64% of white adults, white people in the United States, showed up as having those values when we surveyed voters in 2016. And he correlated that to roughly 11 million white people in total. Now that number could go up or down. This is why it's a rough estimate by a few things. If you only counted people over 18, the number would be more around a little over 9 million. And we also have some reasons to imagine that it has gone up since 2016. So it may be higher now. And of course, statistics are always somewhat imperfect. It's an estimate. Okay, so that is the end of our civics trivia. And for our Zoom audience, I'm putting up a few places to learn more. And I want to thank our podcast audience for tuning in and joining us. We'll be reconvening next week to discuss the Constitution, and you can find us online then. Thank you.